You came back. That was the only thought in her head when the billionaire who lost her finally found her again. But this time, she wasn't the woman he left behind. Because while he could not move on with life without her, she had already built one without him. The ballroom was stunning. That much, Caliph Rohn could not deny. But it was filled with people who had never struggled to pay rent, smiling at each other with the rehearsed warmth of those who needed something. Caliph stood near the edge of it all, holding her glass and saying very little. She had learned early that in rooms like this, the quieter you were, the longer you lasted. Her family had raised her on that philosophy. Peace over power. Diplomacy over dominance. It kept the Rohns out of wars they couldn't win. But it also kept them out of rooms they were never quite allowed to belong to. She was about to find a quiet place to breathe when she saw him. Zirin Vale entered, and the room adjusted. People did not rush toward him. They moved more carefully. Conversations near him became better composed. He was tall, dark hair, carved jaw, and eyes that had the particular quality of seeing more than they acknowledged. Caliph looked at him the way you look at a flame, aware of the distance, aware of the danger, and still unable to pull your gaze away. She knew who he was. Everyone in this city did. She knew about his father, especially with last few months' most viral rumor. Aldrich Vale. A man so convinced that emotion was a liability that he had a lady's family destroyed just because she was dating his son, Kyle. Kyle was Zirin's stepbrother, and he had fallen in love. Not strategically, but simply humanly, the way people fall when no one has warned them properly. His girlfriend had been gentle-natured, from a modest family, completely undeserving of what came next. Aldrich Vale had never raised his voice. Within the span of 4 months, every contract her family held had quietly dissolved. Suppliers found reasons to exit. A building permit that should have sailed through sat unmoved on someone's desk. Small, targeted, methodical. By the time the girl understood what was happening, there was nothing left to fight for. The relationship ended. That was how the Vales handled love. Caliph stood there holding all of that knowledge in her chest, like ballast, and still did not look away from him. Later that night, somewhere between the 3rd hour and a conversation she had no interest in finishing, she found herself in a quieter corridor, the kind that existed in large event spaces for people who needed 30 seconds of silence to remember who they were. She didn't expect him to be there too. He glanced at her as he straightened from a wall he'd been leaning against. Not startled, never startled, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. Then, "You've been avoiding the center of the room all night." She turned to face him fully. "I don't think I was avoiding it. I think it was avoiding me." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Not quite, but a softening. Like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, unlocking by an inch. He spoke to her without asking her name, without placing her family, her business, her rank, without the measuring glance she had received from everyone else that evening. He simply talked to her like a person talking to another person, and she could not remember the last time that had happened in a room like this. She studied him in return, not the air, but the man beneath. The one who seemed faintly exhausted by the version of himself he was required to perform every day. He wasn't cruel. She had expected cruelty. He was contained, and beneath the containment, something almost unbearably lonely. She knew she should leave, but she stayed. What happened later that night was not reckless. It was not a decision made in fire or impulsiveness. It was quieter than that. 2 people, both of them too controlled in their everyday lives, setting that control down for the span of a single night, and finding something underneath it that neither of them knew how to name. She knew who he was the entire time. He never asked who she was. And that difference would come to mean everything. Morning arrived softly, golden and indifferent. Kayla lay still for a long moment before she let herself think. She looked at him, at the quiet rise and fall of his chest, at the way sleep had undone the composure he wore like armor. And she let herself feel it. Whatever it was, the warmth, the pull, the thing that had no safe name. Then she remembered his stepbrother's girlfriend, the permits, the contracts, the silence that came after. She sat up slowly. She didn't wake him. She dressed in the thin, careful stillness of someone who has already made a decision and is simply following it through to the end. She looked at him one last time, because she was honest enough to admit she needed to, and then she left. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because she understood exactly what those feelings would cost. 6 weeks later, Kayla sat alone in a bathroom that felt too small for the size of what she was holding. The test sat on the edge of the sink. 2 lines. She took a breath. Then she went to the doctor. Because she needed certainty, not uncertainty. And certainty, when it came, arrived with a detail she had not prepared for. Twins. She sat in the car afterward for a long time. Not crying. Not panicking. Just sitting with the enormity of it, letting it settle into something she could begin to carry. She considered telling him, briefly, the way you consider a door you already know leads somewhere you cannot go. She thought about Cale's girlfriend, about what Aldrich Vale did quietly, without rage, without announcement, just the slow, efficient removal of everything a person depended on. She thought about her own family. The Roans, peaceful, proud, uninterested in the kind of wars that came with that surname. And she thought about 2 small lives that had not yet chosen anything, that would be handed into a world that would immediately rank them, judge them, if they were unlucky enough to be loved by the wrong son, dismantle everything around them. She could not allow that. When she told her family she was leaving, she gave them the version they could hold without breaking. She was going somewhere quieter, for work, for peace, for a fresh start. They didn't push. They never pushed. Because the Roans understood, perhaps better than most, that some things cannot be explained. Only survived. Her mother hugged her at the door longer than usual, as if she sensed something she wasn't being told. But she let go. Because that, too, was what peaceful people knew how to do. Kayla left with 2 lives inside her, a name she would not speak, and a silence she had decided to make permanent. The years that followed were not easy. She would not pretend that they were. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and simply stared at nothing, holding the weight of everything she had chosen, everything she had sacrificed, everything she refused to regret. There were mornings she woke up before the alarm just to have 60 seconds of quiet before the day required her full self. There were weeks where the math of rent and groceries and childcare was a puzzle she had to solve with stubborn creativity and 0 room for error. But there were also the other moments. Sora, the girl, was born first, and she entered the world the way she would spend her whole life. Loud, fearless, and utterly convinced that whatever was in front of her could be conquered. She talked before she was supposed to. She climbed before anyone thought to worry about it. By the time she was 3, she had opinions about everything and the emotional volume to match. Mirren was different, and different in the way that made your heart ache quietly. He watched before he moved. He felt before he spoke. He had the kind of stillness that sometimes made adults stop and wonder, briefly, if they were the child in the room. He was deeply, fiercely attached to his mother. Not in a way that felt anxious, but in a way that felt chosen. As if he had decided somewhere in his first year of understanding the world that she was worth protecting. Kyleth raised them with intention. She would not let them feel like consequences. She would not let them carry the weight of what they didn't know about where they came from. But sometimes, in the smallest, most unguarded moments, one of them would tilt their head at a certain angle, or go still in a certain way, or look at her with eyes that held something she recognized from a corridor a long time ago. And in those moments, she remembered him. Not the night. Not the mistake. Just him. The version of him that had appeared briefly in a hallway. Exhausted, unguarded, almost tender. Before the world closed back around him, she never knew what to do with those moments. So she let them pass. Zirin, meanwhile, had done what he always did. He worked. He expanded. He acquired. He attended the meetings and signed the agreements and stood at the edges of rooms, composed and unreachable, while his father watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose design was going exactly as intended. Women came into his life with regularity. Beautiful, intelligent, appropriate women. Women whose families were acceptable, whose ambitions were compatible, whose presence made strategic sense. His father approved of them before Zirin had decided anything about them himself. Dinners were arranged. Events attended. The expected progression of a man in his position with a family name that needed maintaining. None of them stayed. Not because they weren't remarkable. Not because he was unkind to them, but because there was a part of him, a locked room he had never managed to access since a certain morning 6 years ago, that simply would not open for any of them. He had not looked for her. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had not looked, because looking would have meant finding, and finding would have meant wanting, and wanting, in the Vala family, had consequences that he had watched his stepbrother absorb in silence. So he had done the thing his father raised him to do. He let it go. Or rather, he had tried. And the thing about trying to let something go is that the effort itself is a kind of holding on. He never replaced her. In 6 years, that fact sat at the back of his awareness like a splinter. Small, invisible, impossible to ignore. The city did not look the way he remembered it. Or perhaps he did not look the way he remembered himself. The business summit had brought him here for 10 days. A gathering of industry leaders, private equity groups, a few quiet government figures who preferred to influence rather than govern. His private residence was prepared in advance. A house his family owned. Large, impeccably maintained, set in a neighborhood that was pleasant without being flashy. His assistant had described the surrounding area as quiet. She had been right. It was the kind of quiet that felt unfamiliar to him now. Not empty, but unhurried. He sat on the back terrace, his first evening there, looking at nothing in particular, and realized he could not remember the last time he had done that. Just sat, without an agenda. He was still getting used to it on the 3rd day when he heard the laughter. Children's laughter. The specific, reckless joy of children playing outside in the late afternoon, with nowhere to be, and no reason to be quiet about it. He was reading something he had already read twice, without absorbing, when the ball came sailing over the fence. He looked up. Then he stood. Because a small figure was hauling herself over the top of the fence with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once considered that she might not succeed. Her braids swung behind her. Her expression was pure focus. One hand gripped the fence post. The other reached for the inside ledge. And then her foot slipped. He moved without thinking. 3 long strides and his arms were already there, catching her just as she came loose, the full small weight of her landing against his chest with a gasp. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she looked up at him, bold, unafraid, completely unbothered by what had just happened, as if being caught by a stranger mid-fall was simply how the afternoon was going. "You have really fast hands," she said. He stared at her. Something about her face, the directness of it, the unself-conscious brightness of her eyes, produced in him a feeling he could not name. Not recognition exactly. Something adjacent to it. A familiarity that arrived without explanation. On the other side of the fence, a boy's face appeared. Wide-eyed, alarmed. He looked at his sister. He looked at the stranger. Then he dropped back to the ground and ran. The girl did not seem worried about this. "That's my brother. He's going to tell our mama," she said, matter-of-factly, still in his arms. "Should I be concerned?" he asked. She considered this with genuine seriousness. Probably not. But she'll be fast. He set her down carefully. She smoothed her shirt with great dignity and looked around the yard with undisguised curiosity. He found himself at a complete loss for what to do next. Fortunately, he didn't have to figure it out, because the girl, this small, unshakable girl, had already spotted the bowl of individually wrapped sweets he'd left on the terrace table from the summit's dessert reception. Her gaze locked onto them with the laser precision of someone who had lived her entire life prioritizing what mattered. "Are those for you?" She asked it like a formality, the way you ask if a seat is taken when you're already sitting down. He found, to his surprise, that the corner of his mouth had moved. Not anymore. Caleth heard the knock of the front door before she registered Mirren's voice. He had come through the back and was already at the entrance. Breathless, eyes enormous. "Mama." Sora went over the fence. She fell. "There's a man." She was already moving. She came around the side of the house with her heart somewhere in her throat, Moran half running beside her, and she turned the corner to the gate and stopped. Sora was walking toward her, perfectly upright, perfectly calm, holding what appeared to be a small collection of wrapped sweets in both hands, like a treasure she had personally won. Caleth exhaled so hard it made her dizzy. "Sora Roan, what did you do?" "I got the ball," Sora said serenely, "and also some sweets." Caleth looked at her daughter, at the composed expression, at the sweets, at the complete absence of any shame. And she did not know whether to hold her or scream. She chose to hold her. But as she crouched and pulled her daughter close, her eyes traveled, briefly, to the fence line, to the house on the other side of it. A shiver moved through her that she didn't understand. She filed it away as adrenaline, as the aftermath of fright. She was good at filing things away. It happened again the next day. The ball went over. This time, no one climbed anything. Sora simply appeared at the gate, knocked with 3 sharp, decisive knocks, and waited. When Zirin opened it, she held out her hand. "The ball, please." He retrieved it, held it out. She looked at him, then at the terrace table, then back at him. He brought the bowl over. She took 2, then, with the moral authority of a diplomat, held one out toward the gate where Moran had appeared, silent, watchful, taking everything in. Moran accepted his sweet, looked at Zirin for a long moment with those careful, measuring eyes, then nodded once, as if he had reached a decision. Zirin was not sure what he had just been evaluated on, but apparently he had passed. The following day, the ball went over again. He was already outside. What followed was a ritual that no one had designed and no one announced. It simply became. Sora talked. She narrated everything, the state of their front garden, something a girl at school had said that was unacceptable, and why. The fact that their neighbor Mrs. Ada made the best jollof rice but always gave it away. Too hot, and a detailed account of why her brother was wrong about the color of a bird they had seen that morning. She talked the way rivers move, continuous, unself-conscious, filling every available space. Marin said less. but he watched with that quiet, unsettling intelligence, taking note of how Zyron stood, how he answered, whether he talked to Sorare like she mattered or like she was small, whether he listened or only waited for her to finish. He listened. Zyron did not know when exactly. He started arranging his afternoons differently. He was aware, in some detached part of himself, that meetings had been rescheduled, that he had declined 2 dinners with associates, that he found himself, on more than one occasion, sitting on his terrace at 4 o'clock with no particular reason, except that it was around the time laughter came from the other side of the fence. He told himself it was simply that he was tired, that the summit was demanding, that anyone would appreciate a small, uncomplicated connection in the middle of a life built from complexity. He was not convincing himself. There were other things he noticed, details that arrived quietly and refused to settle. Sora's stubbornness. The specific way it was not recklessness. It was confidence. The difference between someone who didn't think about consequences and someone who had simply decided they were worth it. Moran's eyes. The way they went still and deep when something interested him, not distracted. Intent. The way both of them, when caught off guard, went briefly, completely quiet, and then came back. He dismissed these observations the way you dismiss something that unsettles you without explanation. He put them in the filing place. He left them there. But they did not go quiet. Then, the moment that broke everything open arrived. The special sweets had been an afterthought, a hospitality gesture at the summit's closing dessert reception. Small, individually wrapped confections, peanut-dusted, specialty made. They were placed at every seat. Several people took extras. Zyron had done the same without thinking much of it, dropping a handful into his jacket pocket and then onto the terrace table when he got home. He didn't even particularly like sweets. But the children did. On the 4th afternoon, when they appeared at the gate, he brought the bowl without being asked. They each took their usual 2. Sora unwrapped hers immediately with the impatience of someone who saw no reason to delay joy, then re-wrapped and kept it back because Moran isn't opening his yet. Moran pocketed his in the careful way he did everything. They stayed longer than usual. Sora was in the middle of a story. Something about a jumping competition and why she had won even though someone said she hadn't. And the light was going gold and long across the yard. Zyron sat on the terrace steps and listened. Moran had settled beside him at some point. Not quite touching, but closer than he usually allowed himself. Eventually they said goodbye with their particular combination of authority. Sora announcing it, Miran executing it, and Zyron watched them go. He saw Kyleth finally unwrapping her sweet just past the gate, before the front path. Then he turned back to his table. He did not see them reach the front steps, still chewing, laughing about something. He did not see what happened next. Kyleth had been in the kitchen when she heard Moran's sound. Not a scream. Not a call for her. Something smaller and more frightening than either. A single gasped syllable, cut short. She was at the front door in 3 seconds. And the world narrowed. Sora was on the ground. Not dramatically. Not the way a child falls when they're playing. The way a body goes when it stops cooperating. She was on her side, one arm curled, her breathing wrong. Visible, labored, a sound coming from her chest like something being pulled through something too small. Miran was kneeling beside her, his face a white-gray color she had never seen on him, his hand on his sister's shoulder, saying her name over and over. Then Kyleth saw it on her chin. The faint residue. The particular oily sheen she had learned to recognize before she ever wanted to. Peanut. She did not think. Thinking was not what the next 30 seconds required. She turned. She ran. She was back with the case in under a minute. The one that lived on the top shelf of her bedroom closet. The one she had hoped to never open in circumstances like this. The one she had renewed and checked and rechecked every 4 months because the alternative was unthinkable. Her hands were steady. She had practiced being steady for exactly this reason. She administered the epinephrine. She sat on the cold step with Sorai's head in her lap and counted, calmly and precisely, through the seconds it took to see the effect begin. She kept her voice low and steady, even when every internal frequency in her body was screaming. She told Mirren he had done well. She told Sora she was there. She told them both. In the quiet, fierce way, she told them everything, that they were safe. By the time Sora's breathing began to ease, and the color slowly crept back into her face, Kyleth's hands, still holding her daughter, had developed the faintest tremor. She did not let go. Later, when both children were inside, monitored, settled, Sora demanding food with the confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted she would be fine, Mirren pressed close against Kyleth's side and not speaking. She sat at the kitchen table. She thought about the sweets, the only place they could have come from, the house on the other side of the fence. And then she remembered the first afternoon when Sorai had come home with a handful of wrapped candy and a beatific expression. The house was not supposed to be occupied. Who was inside it? She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of her children breathing and felt the question, hardening in her chest into something that would not be still. In the morning, she arranged for a neighbor to sit with the children, and she went to find out. She knocked once, firmly. The door opened almost immediately. Kyleth had told herself on the walk over to stay controlled, to stay factual, to say what needed to be said and nothing more. She had been reasonable all her life. She was good at reasonable. And then the door opened, and everything she had been carrying for 6 years hit her at once. Zirin Vale looked exactly like the memory she had spent years quietly dismantling. Same height, same dark hair, shorter now, same quality of attention. The particular focus of someone who had trained himself not to react until he had fully understood what he was reacting to. He looked at her, and that was the end of controlled and factual. His expression moved through something she couldn't fully read, because it moved too fast. A sequence of things that had no clean names. Recognition, incomprehension, then something that had no name at all, something that came from a place behind whatever the mind normally managed. Neither of them spoke. The whole world seemed to decide in that moment to be very quiet. Then she remembered why she had come. You gave my children something with peanuts in it. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. My children are allergic. Both of them. They had a severe reaction yesterday. I had to use an epinephrine injection. She watched his face go through something she had never seen on him. Something that was not composure at all. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. That's why I'm telling you. Not to. She stopped. Because she was standing in the doorway of a house she had walked past 6 times in the last week with her stomach in knots. And the man who had occupied the only locked room in her memory for 6 years was standing 3 feet away, looking at her like she was something he had lost and found and was not certain he was allowed to touch. She looked away. I'm not angry, she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. I just needed you to know, so it doesn't happen again. Silence. Then, Kyleth. Her name. Her own name, in his voice, which she had heard exactly once before, and had tried very hard to forget. She never imagined he could possibly recognize her. Not in her wildest dream. That he could remember her. She looked back at him. How long have you been here? He said. Not quite a question. Not quite anything she knew what to do with. That's not relevant. It is to me. It shouldn't be. Caleth. There it was again. Her name. Used like a thing he was being careful with. The children, he said quietly, and she went completely still. Because he was not asking. He was beginning to understand. She could see it happening. The way the information reorganized itself behind his eyes, the timeline, the ages, the resemblance he had probably been noticing for days without knowing why. She watched Zirin Vale understand that he was a father, and she did not say a single word to help him or to stop him. She simply stood there and let it land. After the rude shock and the awareness had sunk in, Zirin Vale tried hard to recover his lost time. He didn't give her much space to leave, not in a way that was threatening. Not yet. Just with a persistence that was quietly, stubbornly, completely unmovable. He was there in the way that made you understand, without being told, that he intended to remain there. The first time he showed up for dinner, she had not invited him. She had not even seen him approach. She simply opened the door because Moran had said someone was outside, and there he was. Not formal, not apologetic, not performing anything. Just there. She started to say something. But Sora had already appeared behind her, had already seen who it was, had already slipped past her mother with the authority of someone who had decided the situation. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked him. "You weren't invited," Caleth said. "Mama, that's not how to treat guests," Sora said, with the particular patience of someone explaining something simple to someone she loved. Zirin looked at Caleth. The look was asking something. She was not answering. Mirren appeared in the hall, said nothing, and walked back toward the kitchen. Which, in Moran's language, meant, "This is fine. Let's move forward." Caleth looked at both her children. Looked at the man in her doorway. She stepped aside. He sat at a table that had never been meant for him, in chairs that had been arranged for three, eating food she had made with no knowledge he would be there. He did not complain about the cramped fourth arrangement they improvised from a stool from the bedroom. He did not make a single comment about anything that might have highlighted the difference between his world and this one. He talked to the children like they were interesting, which they were. He let Sora correct him twice on things that turned out to be genuinely debatable, conceded graciously, and then, with careful strategy, raised a counterpoint that left her deeply invested in the conversation. Moran watched all of this. At one point, Moran said something quiet and factual about the way birds navigated by magnetic field, completely unprompted, and Zirin did not make the mistake of acting surprised. He simply engaged with it. Caleth watched from across the table and felt something she did not want to feel. He was not performing. That was the problem. The second time was different. Harder. Caleth had a work obligation she could not move. The kind that arrives like a wall, immovable and immediate. The neighbor she trusted, Mrs. Atta, had been unwell for 3 days. The backup she had called was unavailable. She was standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning doing the math of an impossible situation when there was a knock at the door. He was already outside. She would learn later that he had seen her, through his window, walking the children to Mrs. Atta's house the previous morning and had noticed. The way he noticed everything. That something about the interaction was different. That the old woman looked thinner. That she moved slowly. That Caleth had paused at the gate on the way back with a particular quality of stillness that meant she was thinking through a problem. He had kept watching, not intrusively, just attentively. So when she opened the door now with her bag over her shoulder and anxiety she was doing a decent job of not wearing on her face, he was already there. "I'll stay with them," he said. "No," she said. "Caleth, absolutely not. I don't. We are not there, Zirin. We are not in a place where you..." He didn't mean broke something in her defense that she had been carefully constructing. She was cut off by Sora, who had appeared behind her with the specific timing of someone who had been listening and was now ready to participate. "Where's he staying?" Sora asked. "Here," Zyron said. "No," Kalith said. "Yes," Sora said, simultaneously with Mirren appearing in the hallway and saying, simply, "We'd be okay, Mama." And those 4 words from Moran, who said nothing. She looked at her son. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the man in her doorway who was watching her with an expression that was patient in a way she did not know he was capable of. "My number is on the refrigerator," she said finally. "There are rules on the board in the kitchen. There are snacks in the second drawer. Moran's inhaler is in the red case on the bathroom shelf. He doesn't need it, but I want you to know where it is. They eat at 12:30. They rest at 2. Sora will tell you she doesn't need to rest." "She does. I understand," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she left. The morning was not quiet. Zyron stood in a kitchen he did not know, with 2 children who had collectively decided that the rules of the board were suggestions and navigated the particular chaos of a household running at full capacity without its organizing force. Sora gave him a tour of everything she considered important, which turned out to be most of the house. Moran made a project of explaining the exact specifications of the weather today and what it meant for the afternoon. They argued, not unkindly, about something involving a card game, and Zyron found himself mediating with a focus he would have found strange in any other context. His phone began ringing at 10:15. He had a meeting. A significant one. The kind his attendance at was not optional in the ordinary architecture of his life. 3 principals, 2 attorneys, a deal point that had been in negotiation for months. His assistant's name flashed across the screen. He silenced it. It rang again. Mirren was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, working on something in a notebook. He looked up when the phone buzzed the second time, with that careful, watchful expression. "You're supposed to be somewhere," he said. Not a question. A quiet observation. Zyron looked at the screen. His assistant. Then the name of the lead principal. He turned the phone face down on the table. "It can wait," he said. "But it's important," Moran said. Still quiet. Still watching. "So is this," Zyron said. Moran looked at him for a long moment. The same look he had given him from the other side of the fence. On the very first day. Measuring, deciding. Then he looked back at his notebook. The phone rang a 3rd time. Zyron watched it vibrate and did nothing. The name on the screen was one that, 6 days ago, he would have answered before the first ring ended. He let it go to silence. Sora looked up from her corner of the table with a piece of crayon in her hand. "Are you going to get in trouble?" she asked. "Possibly," he said honestly. "Okay," she said, and went back to drawing. There was something in that simple acceptance. Something about the straightforward way she had waited and moved on. That reached into him and rearranged something he couldn't name. He stayed. He was still there when Kalith came back. She did not rush back to distance after that. But she did not move closer either. What she did was something harder. She held herself exactly where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, while everything in her pulled in 2 directions she could not reconcile. Sora had claimed him within the first week in the specific, uncomplicated way of children who love freely and without negotiation. She talked to him about everything. She demanded his opinion on things and then argued with it. She had assigned him a role in her world and expected him to fulfill it, and he did. Without being asked, without missing a beat. Moran took longer. But Moran always took longer, and the reaching he finally did was quieter and far more significant for it. A hand on his arm during a story. choosing to sit next to him rather than across. Saying his name. Just saying it. With the ease that meant he had been accepted into a category Moran did not assign quickly or carelessly. Kalith watched all of it. She watched it, and she felt it. Felt it doing something to the architecture of the resistance she had been building and maintaining for 6 years. Felt the foundations shifting. Felt the parts of herself she had kept carefully locked away beginning, quietly, to stir. She had not stopped loving him. She had never started, technically. You could not love someone from a single night, not really. But whatever she had felt in that hallway, whatever had made her stay when every sensible part of her said to leave, had never fully dissolved. It had simply been filed away, put somewhere she tried not to open. He was making the filing very difficult. But none of that changed what she knew. His family was still who they were. Aldrich Vale still operated the way Aldrich Vale operated. The world the Vale name belonged to was still a world built on control, on the strategic elimination of anything that weakened a position. Including people. Including children. Including 2 small, beloved, completely innocent children who had done nothing except be born from the wrong night. That knowledge did not soften. Love did not soften it. The fact that Zirin himself was not his father did not soften it. Because she had watched his stepbrother. Kyle had not been cruel either. Kyle had been gentle, genuinely, and it had not protected the woman he loved from a single thing. Love inside that family's orbit was not enough. Love, in fact, was precisely the thing that made you vulnerable. It was not one argument. It was an accumulation of them, small and large, early morning and late evening, conversations that turned into silences and silences that turned into more conversations. She would not yield. He could not stop trying. He had been reasonable. He had been patient. More patient than he had been with anything in his life. And patience was not in his natural vocabulary. He had not pushed when she pulled back. Had not raised his voice when she raised walls. Had tried in a dozen different ways to demonstrate something that he had no training in demonstrating, that he was not going anywhere. It wasn't working. And the thought of her closing the distance again, of her deciding once more that the safest thing was to disappear, produced in him a kind of panic that he had no experience managing. It bypassed everything he had ever learned about control, and found the part of him that was simply desperate. He said it on an evening when the children were in bed, and she was standing in her kitchen with her arms folded across her chest, and her expression doing the thing it did when she had already decided something. He said, custody. He said it the way you might grab a ledge you're falling from. Not gracefully, not strategically. Just reaching for the only thing he thought might hold. The word landed in the room with all the grace of something irretrievable. Kalith went very still. Not the stillness of someone afraid. The stillness of someone making sure they heard correctly. Making sure they understood what they were being offered. The silence between them stretched into something enormous. Then she looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not what he expected. Not fury. Not devastation. Something far more measured and far more terrible. Clarity. You don't want that, she said. Quietly. Absolutely. I know you don't want that. That's not who you are. And I think some part of you knows right now that you just proved every concern I've had about what desperation looks like when it has the resources to act on itself. He opened his mouth. She didn't let him. I want to ask you something. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were very direct. And I want you to think before you answer. Not the answer that sounds right. Not the answer that ends this conversation the way you want it to end. I want the true answer. He waited. She looked at him for one long moment. At this man who had sat at her table and eaten her food, and turned off his phone, and been, in every visible way, everything she had never let herself believe he could be. And then she asked, "Can you leave them? Your father, your name, your family's world, all of it. Can you walk away from everything you've been built to be and choose us instead?" The question was precise, clean, devastatingly fair. He looked at her. He wanted to say yes. He could feel the word, feel it, somewhere in the part of him that had stopped sleeping well the moment he found out those children were his. The part that had rearranged his entire interior architecture in the span of a few weeks, with no warning and no permission. But between that wanting and the word was 35 years of a life built inside something enormous. An identity constructed from expectation and training, and the slow accumulation of 1,000 choices he had made inside his father's world. He thought about Moran, saying, "You're more important." And he stood there, in the kitchen of a house that was not his, with a woman who was asking him the only question that had ever actually mattered. And he said nothing, not because he didn't love her, but because he had not known, until this moment, that there was something in him that loved what built him too, and that facing the choice of destroying it was more than the answer he'd rehearsed had prepared him for. His silence was not an absence, it was an answer, the truest and most devastating kind. She looked at him for a long time. She had known, somewhere in the quiet and honest part of her, what the silence meant. She had known before she asked, which is perhaps why she had finally been willing to ask. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, not defeated. Something closer to the sound of a person telling the truth that has been waiting its turn. "Even if you could," she said, "I wouldn't let you." He looked up. "I won't be the reason you lose everything. I won't let my children grow up knowing they were the reason their father abandoned his world. That is not a gift. That is a weight, and I will not put that on them." Her eyes were steady, completely steady, even though everything behind them was not. "And I will not put them inside a world that will see them as a complication, as a liability, as proof that you lost focus. I have spent 6 years making sure they do not feel like a mistake, Siren. I will not walk them into a life where they have to spend them next 6 years proving they deserve to be there." Silence. He opened his mouth, closed it. She shook her head, not unkindly. "I know you didn't mean the threat. I know. But it told me something. About desperation. About what people reach for when they feel like they're losing something. And I have to think about what that looks like when the stakes get higher. When your family gets involved. When they find out." She picked up her daughter's abandoned cup from the counter, set it in the sink, turned back. "I don't think you're your father," she said. "I never did. But you are still his son, and that means something. It means something I have to take seriously, even if it breaks my heart." He stood there. She had said everything. There was nothing left to argue. She walked past him, not coldly, but with finality, and he stood in her kitchen alone, listening to the sound of the house settling around him. Later that night, Caliph sat at the kitchen table. The children were asleep. The house was quiet, the particular quiet of a place where everything difficult had already been said and nothing was left to disturb the air. She did not pretend, in the privacy of her own mind, to be unmoved. She let herself be honest in the way she could only be when she was completely alone. She still wanted him. That had not changed. If anything, the weeks of watching him be gentle, be present, be patient in ways she had not expected and had not armored herself against, had made it worse, better worse. She thought about Moran pressing close to his side during a card game, about Sora correcting his technique on something she had decided he was doing wrong, and him taking the correction with every evidence of genuine consideration. About the phone Moran told him he had turned off without hesitation. About the meeting he had simply not attended. About a man who had walked into her life with the force of something unfinished and then, piece by piece, behaved in every way that she would have asked for if she had ever let herself want it. She thought about his silence. And she thought that too was honest. That was the most honest thing he had done. Because the easy thing, the thing that would have served him, would have been to say yes, to say whatever she needed to hear and deal with the complications later. He hadn't. He had stood there with the full weight of an impossible choice and said nothing. Because nothing was the only truthful answer to a question that had no clean solution. She could not be angry at honesty. She had asked for it. The question was not about love. It was, will they be safe? Not loved. Not provided for. Not given every material thing a powerful family name could offer. Safe. Safe from a world that had already shown her, in precise and specific detail, what it did to people who loved their way in and then became inconvenient. Safe from a grandfather who did not need to shout to do damage. Safe from the particular cruelty of being made to feel like a liability in a life that was supposed to want them. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Sora, bold, fearless, already walking through the world with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been made to feel small. She thought about what it would cost her to be made small. She thought about Marin, careful, watchful, already old enough to understand more than he said, old enough to see, old enough to feel it if the room they were welcomed into had walls. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, the light was still on. She loves him. She knows it now. The children already love him. She sees it every single day. But love has never been the question. The question is, will they be safe? And that question has no easy answer. What do you think Kylith should do? Drop your opinion in the comment section below. Kylith will read every word. And if you also want us to share your story and emotional journey, write "share story" in the comment. And we will be glad to walk your journey with you.